quite a big question for us all to think about is, what is judgment making? Where does it come from? Why do we do it? What's the impact of it? And, for me, I remember from a very early age, understanding what being different means and the experience of being different. And, one example of that is, I was brought up on a quite a dodgy council estate in Nottingham. And, my father left when I was 3 years old. It had a very material impact. We were fast tracked into poverty and we were broke. And when you're in that situation, when you're in a pool where everyone around you's like that, you don't really feel it. You don't feel this sense of, we're in a situation because everyone around you is similar. So you have a sense of unawareness, but also you have a sense of psychological safety through your unawareness. And I remember the first times I started to feel a bit different was when I went to secondary school. And our secondary school was quite a mixed school from different neighbourhoods, around. And I remember conversations in the playground like, oh, you're from that street, you're from that estate, you're from over there, you're one of those kids, you're the kids on free skill meals and stuff like that. You're the kids that get the vouchers to go and get your school uniform and all of that kind of stuff. And I have a memory from a very, very early age, from probably about 11, knowing for sure that being, from over there was not a good thing. And I couldn't articulate it clearly, when I was an 11-year-old kid, but I knew it wasn't a good place to be. I knew there was this layer of judgment making because of our difference. And that's interesting because it starts to have a psychological impact. You start to think, well, what does this over here mean? Why are you describing me in a certain way? And it's this idea of what psychologists call othering. You're othered because of your difference. You're made to feel different because you're not part of that in-group. So we end up with this weird dynamic of in-groups and out-groups and how they play out in life. And then I also remember, as I was kind of growing up as a teenager, growing up, as a gay kid in 1980s Britain was not a good place, right? We had Margaret Thatcher on the throne. This was a time of Section 28. This was a time of, the AIDS pandemic. And the narrative, the social narrative around being gay was really quite hostile. And I think that's really interesting because what this sense of profound difference does, it creates a set of behaviours in individuals. It says, I now don't feel safe to tell you who I am. So you start to kind of hide your identity, you start to cover, you start to withdraw from conversations and stuff like that. And I think these things are interesting because I think actually if organizations want to start thinking about, well, how do we mitigate this stuff? How do we promote cultures which are inclusive and respectful and stuff like that? They can't do that unless they understand the fundamentals of judgment making. Like, where does that come from? Why do we do that? But more importantly, what is the impact of that? And it's interesting because, organizations, this concept which Sheryl Sandberg has of lean in. And I think that's so fundamentally misguided. And the reason it's so misguided is because if you are othered, you're othered because you don't have the same power as everyone else. So it's not a question of leaning in if you're different. My view is it's a question of the culture leaning into you, right? And so I think that's the message which organizations need to think about is you can't say, we don't discriminate against you, so just lean into the culture. Psychology doesn't work that way. So we just need to be much more proactive in terms of wrapping your arms, metaphorically wrapping your arms around somebody and saying, you're psychologically safe here, because there are many people in organizations that feel psychologically vulnerable, not because of anything that organization is doing per se, but the experience of discrimination they may be experiencing in life as a whole. So they're the kinds of things that we need to really start thinking about, in terms of really articulating this notion of eliminating bias, discrimination, and promoting a culture which is, inclusive in the rest of it.